for the introduction. And thank you, Omar, and to Mark, as well as Jordan, for the invitation to come and speak with you here today. It's nice to be back at the Overlook Hotel. And I'll try to keep this under 3 hours so we can go and drink. Cheers. The talk today is new work, really. Draws a little bit from some of the work that's gone in, the previous work that's gone into the development of the Stack manuscript, and a lot of new things that we're working with today. Now, whenever I hear the phrase, and I'm sure, like many of you, the phrase "smart cities," the first thing that really comes to mind to me are Jacques Tati's satires on the follies of modern spatial programming. And then second, perhaps, is Sanford Quinter's allegory of the digital Pleistocene. Now, the later links these supposedly future digital technologies to a kind of primordial relationship to territory. Perhaps our meandering, rootless itinerancy through the generic pathways of the contemporary city, what Kohlhaas calls junk space, tethered to smartphones as we go, scanning, sorting, choosing, is a far less modern way of being urban than it is assumed. Humans as a species have evolved really very little in the last 100,000 years, and hardly at all since the appearance of writing. Our senses, our inherited built-in media, are the same as those that allowed us to survive the predatory rhythms of the primordial savanna. And in the city's real landscapes of information production and reception, those same rhythms persist. Now in communication with our new media and augmented cognition. And architecture, urbanism, one assumes, is at least partially tuned to this. Quinter writes that the contemporary mediascape has given such primacy of place to communication that it has transformed it into a substance itself, the very material of which we and our world are made. Yet all biological substance is founded on signaling. From the very first single-cell organisms nearly 3 billion years ago to the most sophisticated forms of human social life today. There is no family of animal that is not defined by its capacities for signaling, and no ecological niche that is not defined by the infrastructure that supports this signaling. When the human line broke off from its ape ancestors, it was a result of a new capacity for communication, a new eye, hand, brain, mouth machine, and the rise of this new signaling niche in the environment to be filled, the long-distance savanna. Now, so with this in mind, consider perhaps the essential elements of the city, along with partition and the subdivision of space, is to provide a designed incursion into a territorial landscape around which roving bodies might orient their passing. For example, with the excavations beginning in 1994, the Göbekli Tepe temple was unearthed in Turkey and is the oldest human-made place of worship ever found. Its layers of strata, one upon the other, were stacked over centuries. The earliest layers date to the dawn of the Holocene era, about 10,000 years ago. A staggering 7,000 years before the Great Pyramids, more than 6,000 years before Stonehenge took shape, 5,000 years before the first proto-states emerged in the Nile and Indus valleys. The temple predates not only agriculture, but wide-scale sedentary human settlement. It is thought that the temple was a site of worship for numerous hunter-gatherer groups within a 100-mile radius. And significant, of course, for both Neolithic anthropology, and in some sense it has shifted the consensus about the social and technological capacities of pre-agricultural societies. And it does this not only underscores, again, the foundational role of religion in the centralization of symbolic authority, well ahead of the proto-state, but also for the role in the central work of geography or geography, the writing of the earth. We can imagine that for the following game, that for those who follow game, gather fruit, the direction of Göbekli Tepe in the distance may have been a guiding vector around which unpredictable landscapes were measured. Its collection of animal images serving as a roster of possible encounters. Its funeral rituals as a symbolic interface to the mysteries of life and the imagined possibility of triumph in and over death. For unknown reasons, at the beginning of the 8th millennium BC, The entire temple was deliberately buried under 500 cubic meters of soil, preserving it until its recovery in the 1990s. With agriculture also came more permanent settlement patterns, more formal authority structures, as well as the compelling fortification of place by its cordoning off through symbolic boundaries and real walls and borders, bunkers. The space of habitation more forcefully encircles itself, less as a site on an open plain or plain than now as an urbanistic interior. It is food that guarantees this economy, a cycle that envelopes inhabitants into itself, a city that consumes its inhabitants as the inhabitants consume the city. The boundary lines that define the inside of that Neolithic biopolitical economy are inscribed in the making of walls and other designations upon land so as to absorb what it outlines into the larger corpus. In this regard, such urban partitions are also membranes between the inside and the outside, and so qualify another kind of skin, which we'll come back to in a moment. In time, urban economies of eating and not eating, and of including and excluding, will see multiplication and diversification of such skins, some deployed as abstracted infrastructures, others as exposed flesh to be disciplined, sacrificed, capitalized, augmented, consumed, and so on. But as discussed in the in any rate, that it is what finally constitutes the interior or exterior of any linear boundary, any epidermis, and it is its reversibility. In a way, perhaps the most striking example of this was this photo that came from the Yugoslavian Civil War, in which Bosnian Muslims were found by European investigators in a camp in Serbia. And the photos of these images of people inside a camp in Central Europe were circulated around the world and in a matter of days mobilized global public opinion against the war. The strange thing about this photo, and there was a long lawsuit about it as well, was that the Serbs claimed that it was in fact the photographer who was inside the fence and that the prisoners had come up to the perimeter of the fence to look in at her, curious as to what she was doing at the camp. And it is this reversibility of the interior and the exterior along the boundary lines and the politics of the nomination of which is which that essentially is an essential and necessary condition of its operations upon the landscape. Lines provide tension by setting opposition between negative spaces, one to each side, but they cannot ever control how either side is charged in relation to the other. Which one is dominant, which is gathered in, and which is excluded. And at the same time, this is true for urban partitions, urban lines, especially urban grids. Now, this parabolistic history may repeat some distinct, well-worn distinctions between two typical cities. One is a city of movement expressed through nomadic landscapes, shifting perspectives, and impermanent networks, and another city of partitions, permanent centers, and enveloped partitions. And this distinction will appear again in this as our discussion of the dichotomy between Foucault's models of disciplinary power and Deleuze's models of control. Now, for the former, the line is a line of flight, a vector, a trajectory. For the latter, as for Loop's Carl Schmitt in the Nomos of the Earth, the line is an essential differentiation between inside and outside, making distinct the epidermal membrane that holds together a contiguous polity. In the march of colonization, that line also defined the boundary between civilizational interior and the unnamed outside, beyond the pale, so says Schmitt. But just as any line itself is reversible, any inside also and outside, these two careers of the line, also typified by these two cities, are themselves just as reversible. In the universal grid, the line of absolute passage and the line of absolute partition becomes, in essence, the means for the full expression of the other. Like the young girl, old woman perceptual illusion, the figure ground perspective between one ideal and the other oscillates wildly, permanently. So, this is what I would like to talk about today. Again, this work is drawn from this book, The Stack, The stack is looking at the question of planetary computation, the architectures, the structures, the geographies of planetary computation in terms of the model of the stack, like the OSI layer, the TCP/IP layer, and looks at the Earth, cloud, city, address, interface, user as essentially quasi-autonomous layers within a larger verticalized architecture, a verticalized geometry of geography, by which no layer, no jurisdiction finally supersedes the other, that none of them actually coalesce, that it is the antagonism of their dissociation that constitutes the nature of their geometry. So too, in our discussion of each of these layers as independent technologies, the premise is, after Virilio's axiom that that the invention of any technology is also simultaneously the invention of a new kind of accident, to understand the technicity of each of these layers, we have to first pay closest attention to them as generators of accidents. What are their integral accidents? And how the stack as a whole constitutes an assemblage of a meta-accident, and what does it provide us as such? So now, as several have said today, humans are a majority urban species. Now that urbanism has become comparative mega-urbanism, now that geopolitical consortia of cities have the lead over slow, confused federations of nation-states in the governmental response to climate change, now that the management of urban networks presupposes their embedding within information and energy clouds, it is opportune, I think, to reevaluate what sorts of real, last instance sovereignties can be derived directly from urban systems, surfaces, and interface. But to do so requires a situation of the urban within a larger context of exo-urban and xeno-urban forms and forces. And so, for this talk, what we want to think about then is the city as an interdependent layer within a larger planetary scale software and hardware stack. Now, within the stack, the Earth layer provides both the incredible energy necessary to feed the appetites of this composite city, and the energy grids that cast the city layer is a feature upon and within a distributed planetary skin. The epidermal imperative is not only the substrate of a city, of the city layer, it becomes for the stack an operative logic of control and composition. The cloud layer provides the generative and reactive ambient supercomputing that makes active those epidermal envelopes and interfaces and enrolls them into formal and informal governmental dramas. While it sees urban nodes and fabrics as a generic material for computational expression available anywhere and anywhere in principle, the main switches of the cloud are themselves gathered in a tight ring of intensive transcontinental hubs, centralizing bandwidth economies into a few megacells. And away from those bandwidth capitals, cloud data centers, assembly factories, fulfillment centers, call centers, and shipping ports dot more remote geographies and gather itinerant laborers into their midst, or alternatively protect themselves from all human contact. The address layer provides a universal presencing of anything within the urban landscape and the potential for communication between them. Unlike transcontinental postal systems, it is largely agnostic as to exact territorial position between addressees. And unlike the addressing of actors in a legal system, it is equally available to potential addressees at any spatial or temporal scale or degree of physicality. So these territories of addressed instances within the larger expanse of the city layer are named, organized, made coherent and meaningful by the interface that turn maps of addressable options into practical instruments. And for the user, these maps cohere the range of possible interactions and transactions, not only within the city layer, but also within the cloud and within the Earth layers mediated through it. They also provide a channel for the stack to the user, both human and non-human users, in order to model, monitor, and govern their position and terms of participation. Fine. So quickly, before we jump into the city proper and this question, and particularly these questions of megastructures, a quick summary of how we locate the cloud within this as well. Part of the question of the architecture of the cloud and the types of geometries of geography that it produces can be seen here, in that it's not that the cloud erases geography, replaces place or territory. It rather produces another another logic of centralized territory in its own image, what Graham and Marvin call the tunneling effect. And it is not that in any way that the digital might neutralize the architectures of the city into a kind of virtualization, but that it creates in its own image terraformed megastructures, drawing lines upon the planet either by physical inscription of walls and envelopes or by virtual geometries of massless legal borders. It would seem essential to anthropocentric polities, and perhaps the multiplication and confusions of these drawings, jurisdictional designations and subdivisions or refusal of the same points toward an alternative space of geopolitical situatedness. And we see how cloud computing platforms can delaminate normative Westphalian political geography and introduce another asymptotic layer on top of the state's claims over territory. For example, many of you are probably familiar with this strange episode a few years ago, 2 years ago, I think now, 3, by which someone in Mountain View at Google headquarters moved the line that separates Nicaragua and the border between Nicaragua and Costa Rica, and Nicaragua responded by amassing troops on the border and taking the land that Google had bequeathed it from Costa Rica. A few phone calls from Washington put the situation at ease, but the lesson here is clear, that one of the traditional functions of the state has been to describe the exact territory upon which jurisdiction and sovereignty might operate, and that civil society may function, theological say whatever, on top of this objectified domain. That the cloud layer itself would have this privileged capacity to simply to draw the territory in the first instance upon which the state would operate as a higher order actor is exactly the kind of confusions of verticalized geometries within that we're interested in. So, just simply say that fiber geography produces new kinds of structures, new kinds of forms, and systems. One of the things that we're particularly interested in the research that we're doing is the ongoing tension between Google and China, which can be seen in some sort of ways as a certain logic of the sovereignty of geography by which this is controlled by a contiguous Westphalian loop of the nation state, the organization of a particular territory, everything that happens within this is controlled by a particular sovereign power, versus a different logic of sovereign geography of the cloud, which is not placeless, but that is considerably more, but that operates without containment by Westphalian territoriality. And it's not, and that one essentially is superimposed upon the other. Both modes of sovereign claim, both modes of jurisdictionality claim the same site. And it is the tension and irresolvability between these two layers of sovereign claim that, in fact, I think will define the geopolitical issues going forward from this. So at the cloud layer, what we might call the first Sino-Google war of 2009 may well be then an opening crack in a different kind of war over who or what governs society. One less between two superpowers than between two logics of territorial control. One that sees the internet as an extension of the body of the state, or at least beneath the state in the priorities of sovereignty, and another which sees the internet as a living quasi-autonomous, if privately controlled and profited, trans-territorial civil society, which produces, defends, and demands rights on its own. And for this, Google is a Google as a non-state actor operating with the force of a state, but which, unlike modern states, is not defined by a single specific territorial contiguity. Now, while Google is as reliant on real physical infrastructure, its empire of data centers are by no means virtual, that physicality is more dispersed and distributed than partitioned and circumscribed. So the stack then is not, the argument I'm making is then not another prophecy of the declining state withering away into the realm of pure network, but to the contrary, that the state's pressing redefinition is in relation to network geographies that it can neither contain nor be contained by. Now, from the Chinese side, one perspective from this, in this superimposition of two interlocking enclaves, we can consider the breach theory of one Dr. Fan Binjing. Those of you who follow issues around the Chinese firewall would know him quite well. An academician at the Chinese Academy of Engineering, In November 2011, he warned at a conference that the Chinese internet does not have the capability to disable a global internet service whenever desirable. He laments. And he used the example of Google and said that it was a pity that although Google had retreated from China, its service was still accessible. And he says, and I quote, "It's like the relationship between a riverbed and water. Water has no nationality, but riverbeds are sovereign territories, and we cannot allow polluted water from other nation states to enter our country." Now, to extend this figure of water from a kind of Confucian metaphor to a real location, consider that for Carl Schmitt's History of the Nomos, that's Carl Schmitt, not Eric Schmitt, History of the Nomos Political Geography, that the territorial geography of nations was always defined by the naval capacity over the omnidirectional glaciers of the ocean. This is where Virilio pulls from Schmitt. In light of Google's filed patent on oceanic water-based data centers, this floating cyber infrastructure would, in principle, greatly reduce the energy and cooling costs of hosting and serving the petabytes and exabytes of data that will constitute an eventual planetary cloud computing platform. It may also symbolize a productive crisis of territorial jurisdiction, one that alters how truly pervasive computation may demand or activate new forms of agonistic and/or cosmopolitan political habitats. Data centers, the hard technical core of the internet, as you know, use a lot of energy, mostly to keep processors cool. And with something like only 2 of the world's 7 or so billion people using the web at any given month, the anticipated growth curve is steep. Where will the energy come from? How can Google possibly feed the appetite of the data centers that would provide ambient supercomputing to the next 2 or 3 billion human users and the next 50 to 500 billion objects of an Internet of Things? Oceanic data centers would theoretically help solve this by using both a tidal and wind energy to power the stations, as well as the abundant supply of water to assist in the cooling process. But in doing so, the literal offshoring of such critical infrastructures also raises issues about the jurisdiction and legal control of data, to say the least, and the governance of an emergent cloud polis. That offshoring neatly portends the integral accident of the cloud and its layer within a larger stack. That is, the delamination of layers of territory, economy, and sovereignty, one from another, potentially perforating the domain of the state with the economies of non-state infrastructure beamed in from the middle of the ocean. To cities, then, and how the stack expresses itself at the urban scale, which one way which we discuss in this is through megastructures. First thing I'm sort of saying, I spend a lot of time going to architecture schools looking at student work, student proposals, student projects. One of the things I've noticed in the last 5 years more than anything is, 10 years ago, 15, especially 15 years ago, but even 10 years ago, you would go and you would see a student's projects. And essentially, the 4 essential perspectives that any project needed to be used to describe itself were plan, section, elevation, and perhaps an axonometric perspective. This has been largely augmented to a great extent by also satellite perspective. How it is that a building or a project looks from 30,000 feet constitutes, to a larger extent, its faciality. The image economy of global urbanity as a contiguous body implies a dramatic shift in scale from the merely regional footprint to the whole spherical planetary surface. And we have no shortage of imagery depicting planetary urban networks, particularly at night, as a throbbing weave of light, movement. It's less clear, however, what this obligatory geography might communicate other than communication itself. Unlike the Incan geoglyphs of pre-Columbian Chile, for example, the global urban weave has no pictographic content to be read from above. And unlike the earth art and maps of Robert Smithson, for example, it makes no pedagogic point about geologic time and perspective. The contiguity of this urban neural network instead relies on an aesthetics of logistics and from an admiring contentment with networks as a nearly sacralized form and format. And in such renderings, networks more than cities, and specifically the meta-network of the city within the stack, are indeed monumentalized. And the implication is plain. We are those who have wrapped the globe in wire. This is our signal accomplishment of our time. Our pyramids are gossamer shaped. While this investing of infrastructure with deep monumental significance is in no way unique, the real planetary scope of this urban network, if understood not just as links between nodes, but as itself a vast, durable apparatus, suggests a change in the local global telescoping between anthropometric habitat and the wider urban envelope. So the city layer in the stack operates as a kind of massively distributed megastructure and draws upon, however obliquely and opportunistically, the reservoir of speculative, even utopian megastructural projects of years past, realizing them in sometimes perverse inversion of their original intent. Especially around the years of the first photographs of Earth taken from space, that is the late 60s and early 70s, speculative architecture spawned many of today's canonical projects of this type, inspired by the visual scale of grasping the whole of Earth as a comprehensive site condition. In some cases, they may be seen as proposing truly utopian spaces, that is, total islands cut off from the world, per Frederick Jameson's discussion of the utopian as an island, including among these OMA's Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture of 1971, Superstudio's Planet-Spanning Continuous Monument, 1966 through 1977, while others sought the utopian through a maximal perforation of boundaries, other than through the ludic interface or grid, including Arkazoom's No-Stop City, Constance's New Babylon, and the merger of cities into planetary-scale conglomerations was imagined by Constantine Dioxiadis, among others, as an ecumenopolis, or a single urban form comprising the whole world. And Paolo Soleri as an arcology, continental-scale cities rising into the atmosphere. And what we see in this impetus for such massive, even planetary-scale urban propositions may have appeared in both positive or negative reaction to the sort of Buckminster-Fuller-esque modeling of the Earth as a single design problem, and its ecology as an integrated and interdependent web of life, positively or negatively. And they provide in this way a kind of missing link between the progressivism of high modernity, such as the massive Karl Marxhof in Vienna, a neighborhood-sized building from 1930 holding over 1,300 apartments, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, programs for extraplanetary colonies on Mars, best articulated, by the way, in Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy. These were, and among other things, attempts not only to see the whole as a whole, part of the desire for totality, important to the Jamesonian utopian desire, and dystopian anxiety, but in many cases, a proposal for the wholesale replacement of a geopolitical order, of nested and individualized buildings, cities and states, with new models of biopolitical program, perhaps along a continuum from strong architectural authority on the one hand, voluntary prisoners, to an open ludic urban field, New Babylon, and from which the position and imposition of megastructural form is in service of a new spatial order more appropriate to a properly global society. So the stack, both composite interweaving of physical and informational infrastructures in a given site, as well as the differential integration and disintegration of continental urban sites, should itself be understood as a megastructural form or set of forms. And in some sense, its logics are extensive of those of the Apollo-era architectural mega-urbanism: total envelope, universal interfacial grids, superimposition of quasi-sovereign layers, and in other senses, a complete inversion. The regularization of production and consumption cycles, the strong filtering of individual mobility, intensive capitalization of every encounter and gesture, and so forth. And for this, we can trace the after images of these megastructures into the operations of the city and recognize the appearance of their evil doppelgangers. And this is possible because the stack itself is not only itself a megastructure and an arc of totalization, it is itself a platform for totalities. To superimpose and interweave like any platform, it can work as both a control mechanism and as a means for opening and flattening access. In fact, because one becomes the other. And it is not then at least surprising that the distant legacy of these canonical megastructures would be qualified by the reversibility of aspirations. And the examples are not difficult to spin out. We could consider, for example, Foxconn as a megastructure. This is the largest private employer in China, assembles much of the human-scale digital electronics equipment that connects urban society to the stack. A lot of their work is, of course, here in the room with us today. Its largest factory in Longlao, Shenzhen, situates an estimated 300,000 employee residents in its massive live-work complex. One might say that it is also an island and therefore available for both utopian and, has been more the case, dystopian imaginations. Taken as an inversion along some dialectical spectrum of platform or openness and closure, the regimented cycle of life passing from one phase to another, perhaps until death. Foxconn should be seen, I think, along a dotted line from voluntary prisoners. As the factory floor is responsible for the physical assemblage of the world's primary consumer devices, laptops, smartphones, and as these are the essential physical interfaces between users in motion and the recombinant landscapes that they strategize, how is it that Foxconn is also a realization of Archigram's plug-in city, 1968, or Computer City, 1966? We see the essential form of Super Studio's fabulous proposal for continuous monuments realized by Global Crossing's massive deployment of transoceanic fiber optics during the dot-com frenzy of the late 90s. The former is successful as a project, but unbuilt. The later was built, but busted its investors. We see traces of no-stop city in the absolute speed of ambulatory urban computing, and the interfacial city without beginning, middle, or end. We imagine Cedric Price's Fun Palace turned inside out by North Korean stadium pageants, where the audience is the content, but instead of being free to improvise, each is instead rendered into a disciplined pixel in a larger choreographic display. How is Yona Friedman's La Ville Spéciale ancestral to the new Asian smart cities, such as New Songdo, in South Korea, in Incheon development? Or Soleri's Arcology, a rough sketch of Masdar, the massive green city, smart city in Abu Dhabi, built with Cisco and IBM as its key partners. Is situationist cut-and-paste psychogeography realized or crushed by Minecraft? What links the hyper-libertarian secessionist interests of the Seasteading Institute, which would provide for whole populations to live offshore on massive ships floating from port to port? Facebook's funder Peter Thiel is a key funder, with Archigram's Walking City project from 1967, which plotted Star Wars-like landwalker city machines to get up and amble away to greener pastures as needed. For that matter, how to link Cisco and NASA's Planetary Skin Institute, which would blanket the Earth's the globe's epidermal crust with ubiquitous physical sensors on the one hand, and the Death Star on the other. Because as any geek can tell you, that for the Death Star, like for the animal brain, the most important information processing and mission-critical tasks all take place on the outer surface of the sphere. Palm Jeremiah, Taitlin's Tower, the USS Enterprise, the Pentagon, Noah's Ark, Corbussier's Plan de Paris, SimCity, it gets harder to keep all these walled mega gardens separate. Yeah. The Obama era saw a new vogue for infrastructure as the over-leveraged real estate backing of the early 2000s Bilbao effect was supposed to give way to new massive public spending on large built systems that actually did things. But the New Deal didn't happen. For some, then, attention turned to the cheap fix of compressed natural gas over renewables, and for others to preventing infrastructural investment in, for example, airport expansion or the Keystone tar sands pipeline. For the most part, this infrastructuralism sought less to mitigate against the dangers of algorithmic capital and Anthropocenic growth than to update and innovate their armatures. Think of Sir Norman Foster's Beijing Airport, built, versus the North Sea wind farms proposed by Kohlhaas and OMA, not built. Around the time of Obama's second inauguration, we received word that Foster had received a most extraordinary commission. His office was asked to work with the European Space Agency to design structures to be 3D printed on the moon. The prospect of constructing new civilizations from whole cloth on nearby planets and moons has, of course, inspired no shortage of utopian schemes across a political spectrum. And in this case, that cloth is the lunar soil itself, which may be used as the essential building matter from which off-Earth habitations might be composed. This is robotic terraforming as much as off-planet urbanism. Instead of shipping building supplies across the vacuum of space, the mission is instead to send programs, call them what you like, scripts, recipes, algorithms, which used by a robotic 3D printer would build up new structures layer by layer using lunar soil itself as the print material, in time filling the sunny southern lunar pole with new architectures. Now, the choice of Foster for a project like this, is not unexpected, as he is perhaps the preeminent architect of the Google Earth era. Foster might terraform the moon because he has already project by project terraformed Earth. The corollary artificial totality then is ecological. From Masdar, Foster was the architect for Masdar, to the new Reichstag, to the Gherkin, few, if any, contemporary offices have done more to expand the perspectival scale of architectural figuration than his. As said, the satellite view becomes the condition by which the building's faciality is usually understood. The view as opposed to the view from a pedestrian front or entrance. Foster's projects, especially but not uniquely, can be properly considered as well from tens of thousands of feet in the air, as a landscape scale intervention in relation to the regions that they gather into their midst. As megastructures, they pair logics of totality one into the other. The scale of the project suggests a gathering of social totality into a single designed envelope. It's drawn from above, in situ, instead of, for example, from in section, as has been in many cases the norm within the sort of total envelopes. From the palace of the Soviets, OMA's CCTV, Albrecht Dürer's woodcut for the Grand Arch of Maximilian, where the diagrammed space is a living org chart and for which the envelope enclosure intakes utopian aspirations of the client and their publics into an architectural megamachine. The universal platform of the smart city, such as for Foster's Masdar plan, attempts to gather the world into itself less through the anthropometric technique of the envelope than through the anticipatory and parametric management of the discrete energy event. A case in point, Masdar again, a case in point is Foster's massive Crystal Island project in Moscow. A massive 27 million square feet, 4 times the size of the Pentagon, hyperboloid Christmas tree-like tower. This would gather a myriad of residential, cultural, and educational programs under its glass skin. In her essay on the project, Keller Easterling begins by linking this project, as I have, to the utopian schemes of yesterday and today, some now registered into architecture's critical canon, others still languishing in the historical junk pile of unacknowledged visionary cranks. Foster's secessionist island, like Masdar, recommends itself as an exemplar of green architecture, in that it can generate much of its own energy needs, allows for carbon-light internal transportation from home to work to leisure, and as a centralized economy of scale and density for the importation and consumption of resources. Kind of Palos Soleri for Putin. Easterling's critique, however, draws on the Sloterdijkian indefinition of our given planetary condition as a vast interlocking layered interiors, and argues that capital A architecture response to the challenge of the Anthropocene is not properly met by such bubble-era archaeological monuments. It may well be that the policy of megadensity will drive the development of larger and larger buildings, like larger and larger bombs of the 1950s, and larger airplanes of the 1970s. Both of these arms races won, by the way, won in quotes, by the Soviets, with their absurd 50-megaton Tsar Bomba, a bomb so big that it reverberated on the Earth, I don't know, 4 or 5 times, and the 300-foot Antonov 225 airplane, the largest airplane ever built, neither of which put to any direct use, and now Moscow can perhaps claim Crystal Island to this collection of hypertrophic trophies. It may well be that the scalar recalibration of the built interior will have the positive effect of drawing more and more networks and even territories within one building's single intelligent interfacial design. But even so, the proper architectural address of the design challenges of the Anthropocene, its permanent ecological exception, remains with the conceptual recalibration of the planet itself as already a megastructure. Ladies and gentlemen, we are floating in space. So, the architectural imaginary then now shifts its professional assembly of buildings to another register. In this context, it's worth evaluating how real cloud platforms, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, do in fact imprint and express their territorial presence through architecture as an organizational medium. And by this, I mean less how we can trace their subterranean tendrils through data centers and fiber optic lines than to observe and interpret the megastructural headquarters built to house the human intelligence of the cloud corporation of Silicon Valley. For example, the Chrysler Building, designed by Willem van Allen and for Mr. Chrysler himself in the late 1920s, could be taken as a kind of exemplary of an older contiguous and self-contained organizational body. The preponderance of a company's executive staff cohabiting a vertical castle, gathered into a single internalized hierarchy, modeled through the stacked floors and rigid postures of the tower. In his ponderous film, Cremester III, Matthew Barney takes on the construction of the Chrysler Building as an occult epicenter of the bygone symbolism of industrial power, wealth, and natural hierarchy. The conspiratorial conflict of his film involves the architect, the entered apprentice, and something to do with Masonic lore and the grandiloquent opacity of old money. In considering the Googleplex in Mountain View, or the proposed new Apple headquarters in Cupertino, we might well wonder if some future Matthew Barney, which is just a horrible thought in and of itself, will he dance through the hallways and profiles with similarly obsequious reverence? Instead of being stationed within the magisterial Art Deco appointments, as were Chrysler's elect, Googlers lunch together on Artlist.com furniture, but while they do, they enjoy free gourmet meals. Why fuss with money? Why fuss with money when something far more valuable is being hatched during the meal? Available on-site amenities include massage, free bikes, indoor rock climbing, and regular symposia with thought leaders on a range of topics. Efforts are made to couch the programmer lifestyle within its own idiosyncratic luxuries and to dampen any distraction or discomfort that might interrupt collaborative innovation, including perhaps going home. Google's clever, infamous, and seemingly obtuse interview questions guarantee that entrance into this rarefied colony is carefully filtered according to demonstrable acumen and pedigree. The Googleplex may serve as a kind of model suburban spatial platform for the crafting and maintenance of global software platforms, but is a highly selective population by design. By contrast, looking at Frank Geary's proposal for the new Facebook headquarters in Menlo Park, We see a plan for a corporate campus designed, it appears, to ensure the staged contact between employees in motion. Winding pedestrian pathways, strategic lines of sight connecting interior and exterior views, all embedded on a multi-level landscape where sub- and superterranean greenery twists and turns and under the collection of buildings. This aggregate social graph of the employee population is framed and is displayed to itself as it moves and involves itself within itself. It's probably then not too obvious an observation to note that the collected body of Facebook employees is here mediated by Geary's proposal as a network in motion, one that will perform at a higher level were its undulating topologies given exact architectural curation. Unlike Google's site, defined by robust services in a generic no-frills context, perhaps like Google itself, Facebook seems more tuned to the advantages of the active performance and structured monetization of human networks, perhaps like Facebook itself. For their part, Amazon recently signed a 16-year, $1.5 billion lease on a huge high-rise campus in South Lake Union neighborhood of Seattle from a group headed by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen. In this sort of generic complex, we have blah, 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 corporate stuff. Not very interesting. What is more interesting about Amazon's footprints in this context is, of course, its archipelago of logistics centers. In mountainous regions of the Earth, trees above the cloud line are sometimes invisible from the vantage points of cities below. But for the cloud layer of the stack, what is invisible is not what is below the line where the computation, what is visible is what is below the line where computation touches the ground, unseen but never placeless. The weird urbanism of the cloud is not just about the virtualization of terrestrial borders, but also the re-centralization, urban, financial, logistical, in the service and purpose of the network. Former Russian military command bunkers turned into icy data centers for Microsoft in Russia. Entire skyscrapers in downtown LA turned into massive stacked switching hubs by the Carlyle Group. For Amazon, it makes its own temporary logistics plantations at ex-urban perimeters or near and inside regional airports. The warehouse and supply chain centers that turn commands in databases into the traffic of real goods constitute a shadow network of itinerant packages and only slightly less itinerant laborers in feudal charge. Amazon's, and Walmart's for that matter, fulfillment centers in places like Hebron, Kentucky, Goodyear, Arizona, Fernley, Nevada, are manned by a multi-layered, outsourced and re-outsourced population of temporary sorters, packers, and movers. During Christmas, when demand for short-term labor is acute, Amazon will make use of work campers, often senior citizens moving in large recreational vehicles from one fulfillment center to another, coming and going from Amazon towns as demand dictates, guest workers of the algorithm, Grandpa, the wandering Morlock of the cloud. But perhaps the boldest architectural statement made by a cloud platform is the new Campus 2 in Cupertino, as proposed by Apple and, of course, Norman Foster. During Steve Jobs' last years, when Jobs pitched the plan to the Cupertino City Council, he actually neglected to mention that it was Foster's design. Plans show a giant Torg spaceship, Jobs' word, landed among the apricot groves in apparent pre-launch posture. The design harkens to Eero Saarinen's Watson Research Center for IBM and many of the mid-century urbanist campuses. But Foster's closed ring fits an entire campus in one building. It resembles Herzog and de Meuron's Allianz Arena as transplanted from Munich into more bucolic Northern California. Or perhaps a Baha'i-inspired UFO straight from a Michel Houellebecq novel. A good place for mass exodus to the afterworld. The loading has begun. The vast closed circle, perhaps some reference to One Infinite Loop, Apple's headquarters, current postal address, contains 2.8 million square feet of interior space, but appears to have no explicit front or face to the world. No real front or back or beginning or end. The 150-acre spread boasts an 80% landscape footprint. Descriptions used in the proposal like integrated, and that it will create a physically unified community, rather understate the insularity of this habitat with its central plant, carnivorous underground, and off-site parking. Once employees have made their way back to the surface from the subterranean automobile archipelago, they will look out and see only the forest for the trees. Withdrawn into this island package, Apple will enjoy the benefits and suffer the fragilities of a reserved enclave. Bunkers imply security, control, purification, impenetrability, but like the walled garden of iOS, it can suffer from having to be both platform and content at once. As others have observed from the distant sidewalks across the entrance roads, this sort of suburban walling off of a corporation population may be less futuristic than a throwback to the 1950s. As opposed to the, quote, creative class strategies of urban contact and stimulation, here Apple recedes and succeeds into the controlled space of the curated platform megastructure. Or perhaps the gesture is working at a much larger scale, not in relation to any proximate downtown, but as for all of Foster's projects, part of a higher stakes process of terraforming the Earth and building his distributed portfolio of Earth bases, in many cases directly on behalf of the stack's expression. Shape of things to come. What has already been said about the Apple, and we all know about its closed sort of platform then, is seen here extruded into an architectural strategy, curated and closed off, explicitly branded, secretive and opaque, totalizing and majestic, theologic in rhetorics, if not actually cultish, affectively perfected. The utopia on offer to its users is for some an ecstatic platform that transcends mere computation and extends toward a realm of full creative self-realization. That the social contract of that experience would demand such secrecy and silence, restriction and exclusivity is not necessarily unusual as a form of political theology. That it would be invested in branded equipment that connects users to the cloud layers of the stack, however, is of greater novelty. Yeah. In considering the larger footprint and expression of the Apple Cloud Platform into the city layer of the stack, we would also note that the integration of closed megastructural platform model will include Foster's refresh and redesign of Apple's most public terrestrial presence, its hundreds of branded retail stores. That Foster's office would become the house architect of the Apple platform's human-facing earthly permeation suggests that his acumen with megastructures will serve to organize the physical expression of the Apple cloud polis at the city layer more generally. Apple has invested the symbolic economy of the megastructure in ways that other platforms have not, including the ambition to utopian totality. Certainly the data centers, warehouses, logistic parks that give shape to Google, Amazon, Facebook are no less geographic in their scope, but they are not foregrounded as the face of the cloud polis in the same way. The incipient cloud polis of these other platforms does not rely on the ethics and aesthetics of total design closure with nearly the same intensity as Apple does. Google's networks are megastructural in their scope and universality, but they do not observe the guardianship of interior borders as an essential principle of the logics of sovereignty, whereas Apple's do. With Foster's commission to design 3D printed structures on the moon, one may ask if the stack's expression at the city layer through the megastructure represents, again, its portfolio of moon bases. Is this design properly suited to post-Apollo logics of geographic scale and the recognition of any project's expanded planetary situation? Or is it ark building for paranoid secession, designed to sustain life on a hostile alien planet, even if that planet is our own Anthropocene Earth? There are surely many ways to characterize how the megastructure works as an expression of the stack at the city layer, and from these to draw out many different implications. Unlike a moon base or Buckminster Fuller's Dome City, for example. Many such structures are not designed for the permanent or even semi-permanent housing of people in settled encampments. Like the temple at Gölbekli Tepe, they are monumental switching stations through which we might pass on our way. Their scale and centrality demands this passage, and the arcs of our movements are composed in their bending towards these gigantic nodes. We don't reside at the Beijing airport, but we must pass through its body if we are to reach the next level of our passage into or out of China. Further, many are not only impermanent, but they are designed for they're not even designed for the mediation of people. Most of the very largest buildings accommodate and express the algorithmic resorting and distribution of objects, commodities, cargo, from sites of extraction to assemblage to consumptions and back to landfills in the production cycle. The relative freedom of inanimate objects to cross borders and gather global materials into themselves appears in many ways less restricted than the passage of people, bound as they are to the rights and restrictions of citizenship. The more intensive impact of algorithmic capital onto physical matter is in the molecular reassemblage of stuff, the global distribution of things, and the computational optimization of their itineraries through supply chains. As the city layer, this object-oriented economy of molecular logistics is expressed in geographic megastructures, such as the warehouse in San Bernardino, California, near where I live, one that is so large that its floor has been laser leveled against the curvature of the earth. So instead of walls and windows, these spaces are governed, as has been said, by barcodes, RFID chip scanners, and populated by robotic platforms, shelves, and stockers. They can easily lift over a ton of goods at once. But first, our discussion, I want to go to a black then. But our discussion of megastructure then as a typical expression of the stack at the city layer needs to be intertwined with another mode discussed above, and that is the integration of urban, especially mega-urban economies of people, information, value, material energy, and meaning into vast, uneven, and asymmetrical web of both settlement and mobilization. As indicated by our common situation within these various channels and envelopes, that connection and disconnection of individual cities into regional and transcontinental networks that exceed their geographic position makes explicit that one is not only within one specific city at a time in which they are located, but are also inside a general urban fabric that torques and folds around the planet, connected and severed at various points. In this, some megastructures have a unique relationship with others, such that their enveloping closure in one place belies their dependence on external structures, perhaps a continent away, for their own energy, purpose, and support. For example, Apple's spaceship in Cupertino, where design and strategy live, cannot possibly exist without the Foxconn megastructure in Languao, Shenzhen, where Apple's products are assembled from parts into the perfected slabs that tether us to their cloud platform. Even as occupying different corners of the globe and selectively ignorant as to what goes on in the other, these two megastructures are intimately paired. The two share a unique bond across the strange distances of the mega-urban networks, binding them together in ways that both penetrate the solidity of their total envelopes by revealing their interdependence with the exterior world, as well as mimicking one envelope into another. Foxconn's fences and suicide nets. You're aware that after this rash of suicides at the planet, they put the suicide nets outside the building. Foxconn's fences and suicide nets as Apple's apricot fields. Foxconn's dorms and Apple's subterranean parking. Foxconn's massive assembly lines and Apple's customer service protocols. Together, these two megastructures, along with the network of retail store embassies, constitute a territorial urbanicity that the Apple Cloud platform rests upon. But the relationship, this resting, is a fragile symbiosis. like the Eloy and Morlock from H.G. Wells' Time Machine. The megastructures, the two paired populations, share the same world, but inhabit different spaces. One above ground, the other underneath. One living in the perpetual innocence of play and leisure, experience, design, innovation, oblivious and uninterested in how it all appears every morning. The other running the machine underneath, toiling against the earth, forcing it to produce the bounty over and over again. It is perhaps then a bad omen for Cupertino that the bargain between the subterranean world of the Morlocks and the surface world of the Eloy is maintained only because periodically the Morlocks harvest Eloy like cattle and eat them. The cannibal economies between networks of megastructures are not always what they first appear. Okay. Now, I wanted to talk then a little bit about a project that we're doing at UCSD. I don't want to keep you here trapped Fidel Castro-like in a 4-hour lecture, so I'm going to sort of jump through these things very quickly and then make some concluding remarks. So if you can bear with me a little bit, we'll sort of switch modes here a bit, and then we'll conclude with some remarks here as well. So the project that we're working on here, the Center for Design and Geopolitics at UCSD, there's a number of research tracks we have going on here. Cloud Polis is one of the research tracks, Deep Address, which I spoke about yesterday at University of Western Ontario. And another one is a project called Nano Skin, which we are running in conjunction with the Laboratory for Bio-Nano Engineering, Joseph Wang and Todd Coleman's group as well. And what we're really interested in here is the use of printed electronics at the epidermal level and nanotechnology that can chemically augment epidermal sensation at the level of the skin. And the idea is based in many ways simply on the idea that the skin is our largest sensory organ. Of course that it is. We've had at least 150 years of the augmentation of sight as a sensory organ, more the augmentation of audition as a sensory organ, and that these new technologies allow for a similar kind of transformation, prostheticization, augmentation of skin as a sensory organ. And if Kittler is even half right, that it's only in the prostheticization and augmentation of a sensory media into media technologies we come to understand what that sensory media actually is in the first place, then perhaps we have a much wider area to look at than we may have otherwise. It's also based in many respects on the notion that modes of biopower, particularly within urban contexts, have shifted from recently according to this similar kinds of epidermal involvement. So from, as Deleuze describes in his Society of Control essay, from a Foucauldian panoptic model by which bodies are fixed in place. They are disciplined by their location within a particular institutional context. Their immobility becomes the condition of their governance. To a Deleuzian model of control by which bodies are able to freely roam wherever they please, and because any interface or switching point or pathway through which they might move can govern the conditions of their trace, can keep them, understand them, and control them. Go wherever you want because there is no outside. To one instead in which the epidermis, the literal skin of the bodies that move itself, becomes the site of the governance. Not the partition of the building, not the interface or switch gateway, but the skin itself. And if you are flying back here, you will have your skin sensed by different machines. You'll have your objects sensed by machines. It is the skin of the objects that will be governed for danger in one way or another. We spoke about Cisco and the Planetary Skin Project, by which the model of eco-governance, climate modeling, carbon governance is structured around the sensing of planetary skin and its chemical, elemental, energistic profiles, one way or another. So these are some of my colleagues at DGP who were led from a recent event. We're working here as well on this project. We have Daniel van der Velden from Metahaven, Ed Keller from Parsons, Daisy Ginsburg, who've done and rated these people, and a few other people who've been working with us on this project here. We're inside the Nano 3 room, which is the clean room at Cal IT2, where we do most of this work here as well. And I just wanted an excuse to show this picture mostly as well. So one of the recent projects we did around this as well was Wang's lab had developed through military funding, had developed these sensors that go on the outside of the clothes of a soldier as he goes through spaces, and the sensors smell the chemical signatures that are commonly used in improvised explosive devices at a parts per trillion sensitivity. So the soldier goes into the space. If any of these chemicals is present in a room or this size, the sensor will go off, and his skin will be able to denote the presence of this risk and danger as well. So, of course, my interest when working with projects like this is in many ways to invert the military logic of them towards something else. But also, the first thing that occurred to me was that ink, and the next thing they were doing with this was these tattoos that go on the arm at level of ink, so that the sensor can actually is coated within ink, and the ink can go on the arm of the soldier, not even on the outside of the clothes, so that literally their physical skin is sensing these things about them. So the first thing was thinking like, well, okay, we have this augmentation of skin. What types of things in the world might we want to be able to sense if we could transform and remediate the chemical sensitivity of the epidermal sensory layer, which is a more open question, obviously. The second one is ink. That paint is simply ink at a larger scale. So we can use paint as a way in which to do this as well, and paint is a way in which we augment not animal skin, but building skin. We augment building skin as well. So this is a project which we used with Wang's ink, which was the chemical sensitive thing. Obviously, it's this pun on Foucault sort of here as well. But the whole thing is painted in this explosive sensitive ink. So that this graffiti, the sense, instead of the panoptic logic of the observed is hidden from the observed, here the observer is right out in the open. It's looking at you right in the eye, but you don't know that it actually is the observer. And I think this is also part of this shift from the disciplinary model to the epidermal model of biowarfare, is this disclosure of the terms of surveillance in a way that is utterly apparent. So this is the sensor. This is the bomb sensor that you have in front of it. And there's a little bit of microelectronics built into it. We test it around. You shoot this thing, and it does exactly what it exposes sort of to do. The next thing that we did, I'm going to go through this very quickly because I want to make some remarks. We're using this around, trying to expand this in a different kind of context. It was originally the idea of this came after the Aurora shootings in Colorado. One of the obviously disconcerting things about living in America is that if you try to do a project around guns, that by the time the project is done, there's another event around which the project about guns may be apropos. So before Newtown, after Aurora, this was sort of an event, was to use the temporary tattoos that we developed with this as well, the consensus explosions, and tune them in a certain way towards the signature elements of recently fired guns. So that if there was a recently fired guns in the midst, that the body of the crowd, the anonymous thickness of the body of the crowd, which is the object by which any of the anonymous attackers might move, itself becomes the sensing mechanism against which a concealed weapon is unconcealed. That is, that the terms of the epidermal biopower is reversible, and because it's reversible, it obviously has hopefully a more ambivalent politics. And then last week or 2 weeks ago or whenever it was, you'll remember that the suspect 2 in the Boston Marathon bombing was identified and captured not by any sort of Foucauldian or Deleuzian apparatus, though I suppose this sort of line of sight certainly is, but as you know, by his heat signature. That it was the heat profile from his animal body, that essentially this epidermal singularity within the larger urban landscape that allowed him to be identified and capture this as well. A kind of key moment, I think, and there's this epidermal biopower. Right. So I'm going to then, with your indulgence, make a few concluding remarks, in a couple moments. On the topic of the Anthropocene and what I call the post-Anthropocene, particularly in terms of what within the larger continent of philosophical work rotating around the questions of speculative realism is called accelerationism, and accelerationist political aesthetics in particular. So bear with me for 5 more minutes, and then we can go get happily drunk together. Any conjunction between aesthetics and politics, for a political aesthetic, an aestheticized politics, a geopolitical aesthetic, politics of aesthetics, is necessarily fraught. But even more so, should we conceive of their interactivation from a willfully ahumanist perspective? Aesthetics and or politics of what and for whom? The cascade of anthrocidal traumas from Copernicus and Darwin to post-colonial and ecological inversions to trans-phylum neuroscience and synthetic genomics, from nanorobotics to queer AI, and on, pulverize figure-ground relations between doxic political aesthetic discourses and aesthetic traditions. So before any local materialism for the biologic body, formal economics, the military state, the legal corporation, the geographic nation, or an immanent theology, before any of these can conserve and appreciate its self-image within the boundaries of its preferred reflection, already its Vitruvian conceits of diagrammatic idealization, historical agency, radiating concentric waves of embodiment, instrumental prostheticization, and manifest cognition are, in sequence, unwoven by the radically asymmetrical plastic indifference of matter across unthinkable scales, both temporal and spatial. The normal brief for political aesthetics, then, is denuded by abnormal assignments that proliferate. This avenue towards posthumanism, then, is a reckoning with planetarity and its incompleteness. Geophilosophy, by one path, ambles from a Ptolemaic yoke, nested within protective layers of crystalline spheres, to a Kantian geography for which the commonality of the earthly surface generates and guarantees a cosmopolitanism, to Deleuzian and Schengelian solutions of the painterly image force into numinous or occult conspiracies of geologic violence, and now toward a comparative planetology for which the Earth as a mediating polis can only be thought through aesthetics derived immediately from, not imposed upon, the computation of possible geometries, subdivisions, doubles, inversions, localizations, and Hubble-scale adoptions from the outside. One local planetary within a more universal recombinancy. So from that outside, looking back in, the generative alienations brought by potential xenopolitics, xenoaesthetics, xenoarchitectonics, xenogeoaesthetics, and so on, turn back upon the now inside-out geopolitical aesthetics for which the relevance of human polities seem weird and conditional. So how might we grope toward an inventory of these contingencies? What index of effects would allow us in this regard and in this situation, even as it is unresolved and perhaps unresolvable for us? So in regard to the transformability of relations to these displacements, what could do the work for a geopolitical aesthetics, even and because it refuses the phobic bigotries of formal political aesthetics, by and for a nearly extinct Anthropocene subject? If the term can refer to that exteriority more than to our own tiny machines, is this an acceleration of the geopolitical aesthetic, and if so, towards what absence? Now, this term accelerationist aesthetics, this is from Stephen Shaviro's book Post-Cinematic Affect. And for him, Shaviro strongly differentiates this from an accelerationist politics. For Shaviro, the value of an acceleration aesthetics is to draw out what it feels like to live in the contemporary moment partially determined by inhuman displacements like the ones we've been discussing today. But also particularly for Shaviro, construed through the suicidal demands of capital by conjuring prototypes of what comes after the inevitable Anthropocenic crashes, so that we might envision and evaluate our adaptations in advance. This indulgence in imagining without reserve the world without us presupposes scopes of catastrophe rather than blithely offering up pap design innovations with which we might spend our way out of death. But for this, thanatos is not a diagnosis, it is simply a sight condition. And so far, so good. But for Shaviro, this becomes an exercise in cognitive mapping that might provide, I quote, the individual subject with some heightened sense of place, unquote. Now, I would take strong exception to this last recommendation, and conversely for Severo, that an accelerationist politics does not contain what it reads. It comes with no discernible, coherent response for the amelioration of eco-economic entropy, no clear path out, no dialectical guarantee of ultimate outcomes, and this is its strength. It shouldn't be disqualified as a suitable program for apparently well-understood communitarian outcomes, whereas the corollary aesthetic project Severo recommends might contain a useful pedagogical spark that could, at some distance, train and redeem a recognizable politics through the shock of its unrecognizable aesthetics. In a way, my interest is actually the exact opposite: an unrecognizable politics through a recognizable aesthetics, by drawing collapses, not distinctions, between the two. Foremost is to make it utterly impossible to organize our situation among the displacements as anything like an individual subject. This is the first to go, but apparently not the last to leave. To predict and prototype what will and will not survive the Anthropocene demands speculation upon irreducibly complex material interdependencies of oil, nitrogen, water, oxygen, silicon, rotting iron, insect biomass, plankton genomics, and so on. And to design the potential consequences, urban consequences if you like, of the fatal effects that the subtraction or amplification of any one of these might have upon the others. These are impossible to know, and yet nothing, of course, deserves more attention. And so anything like a geopolitical aesthetic in the Jamesonian sense, for him a cinematic mechanism, however conspiratorial, is necessarily an exercise in apophenia. You know what apophenia is? The sensory perception of one input track that we assume to be congruent with one of the others, sort of like the iTunes visualizer. You would think that these things are moving when in fact they have no relation to the music. This is the geopolitical aesthetic of the moment, drawing connections and conclusions from sources with no direct connection other than their indissoluble perceptual simultaneity. This is neither a failure of imagination nor a virtue, but rather an unavoidable qualification of our predicament and its only partially desirable range of effects. There is and cannot be a post-Anthropocenic politics in any recognizable normative sense that is predicated on the self-regard of the human subject, mapping himself as a coherent agent of his essential condition. So toward this, instead of the notion of post-capitalism as the futural specter, I prefer the more encompassing post-Anthropocene. The latter names not only another eco-economic order, but presumes in advance the displacement of the human agent from the subjective center of its operations. It presumes the framing of geologic scope and comparative planetary scale. It does not name the necessary terms of advance for what they will have to describe and contain as some precondition for its mobilization today. The aporia of the post-Anthropocene is not answered by the provocation of its naming. And this is its strength over alternatives that identify too soon what exactly is to be gained or lost by our passage off the ledge. It indicates that the organizing work of a xeno-geopolitical aesthetics can be done only in relation with a mature alienation from human history and anthropocentric time and scale. While it foregrounds the eclipse and extinction of this particular modality of the species and restricts and restrictive industrial modes of governance through the design, it also presumes by provocation not only that humanism disappears with humans, but that the more elemental genetic machines with which we now co-embody flesh can and will in time reappear and express themselves as unthinkable new animals, and with them, new earths. In this, perhaps, the most essential gambit to be carried forward from the design conjunction of any properly accelerationist geopolitical aesthetic is the one that locates its mutation in the futurity of both evolutionary disappearance and reappearance, conservation and expression, as codependent outcomes, including, finally, as well, extinction. Consider then the archifossil offered by Contan Miasu in his After Finitude, offered as an evidentiary demonstration of the encounter between the abyssal temporal reality of our own ancestrality with the universal alienation of thought as necessary in and for worlds, even those worlds of fossilized primordia, which can in time contemplate through an encounter with this geologic stain. Now, the leverage point from local traces and effects of our contingent disorientations, our apophenias, our aesthetics, our design, must pivot and rotate that fossil's temporal trajectory for our ancestrality and descendants. That is, just as we are forced to deduce in the fossil the contingency of a world that precedes thought, we are also forced to encounter in advance, as a measure of the present condition, the descendant for which we are the ancestor and for which we are the unthinkable fossil. Yet that descendant cannot be held in hand, even as its chemistry storms within us and even around us now. Our dislocations from the center of planetary history are corollary to the diminution of cognition as a condition of encounter with the Cenozoic fossil, but also our presence as an anterior precondition of our future dissolution, which is also the appearance of another unthinkable phylum on planet or off planet, for which our thought and trace will be as alien, inaccessible, horrifying in its indifference as the trilobite is for us. So for this, Thanatos is a less central economy, as the passage from organic into inorganic is just as easily inverted, and extinguishment may be overtaken by emergence. At work is instead then not eros, the conservation and the reproduction of the organism, but to the contrary, a scanning for which the fate of the organism is to be cast off like dead skin, so that something irregular might arrive from within and without at once, over and over again, until, through genetic and allogenetic iteration, the vestigial trace of the humanic ancestor is absorbed. While the work of organismic evolution may be to find ever more circuitous paths towards death, the work of the expanded phylogenome is a more open-ended convolution towards adaptation, invention, and reiteration. The geopolitical aesthetic for which we might modulate the contemporary moment from this retrospection in advance of that futural catastrophe must be situated in this necessarily post-Anthropocenic alienation. Instead of in the conceit that should Anthropocenic ecological collapse make familiar human systems untenable, that then the chemical and genetic projects localized in our phylum, biomass, and phenotype will have no reality. They may or they may not. Either way, the best of all possible news is that should we survive the Anthropocene, it will not be as humans. To the extent that this displacement can be drawn, felt, governed, modeled, then a post-Anthropocenic geopolitical aesthetics has meaning. Otherwise, it's none. And a last word on computation in the city. If anything at all, it is the machinic inhumanity of capitalism and not its humanization that most strongly recommends it, and which requires more care on our part to better realize. What mathematician Giuseppe Longo calls the next machine, that is the one that comes after computers and computation, and whose processes might then provide the epistemologies of life, thought, and systems, as computers do today, will also involve the next economics. And we assume that neither of these are likely to arrive without one or the other already in tow. Whether they can or will or should arrive to us, or for us, or about us is a different matter. That they may arrive once for our descendants, we are unearthed as speechless, mineralized fossils. Or maybe faster if we can hasten it. Thank you.
Also evocative of some others in a kind of legacy. But for me, for instance, the Apple headquarters is evocative of Isamu Noguchi's Monument to the Plow. But there's a kind of reversal where one is meant to be viewed on Earth and another one from Earth. And similarly, terraforming itself, which already has a little bit of its backstory of being engineered by someone who had worked on integrity, with Dr. Mr. Fuller.
Yeah.
This kind of history of an ecological discourse that attended an earlier version of terraforming. So on the one hand, I'm wondering about what these kinds of new images of terraforming start to suggest once they jettison that whole ecological discourse, where you might have something like the movie Silent Running. You gave some examples in fiction.
Mm-hmm.
This kind of capitulation to Earth atmosphere's collapse that starts to generate these images for a new surface and a new terraforming. And yet that's not what's behind any of these new images.
I don't know that that's, maybe that it is. So it's a provocative series of questions as I take it. Let me take a bit very quickly, one at a time. And then is that you're absolutely right that there's a repetition of the geometries of the stack that's work here, from the sphere with the intensively intelligent skin to literally this sort of stack as a particular protocological architecture by which any layer has a kind of semi-autonomous technicity in relationship to the other, as both a descriptive technology and as a generative technology. And in both cases, I'm arguing to a certain extent that these are ecological imaginaries, to the extent that, at least as I presented here today, they are responsive to a visual and symbolic imaginary of planetarity as a coherent whole that we may draw. We could, just for the sake of argument, point to the Apollo 8 images as a sort of originary point, that they're models by which the political and jurisdiction, the political imaginations of how it is that we might design social life and connected urbanicity within a global condition are worked through. And in two ways. One is through a continuous surface, which is the sort of the planetary skin model, the Death Star. There's essentially that there's an undifferentiated surface on the relation of the sphere. Right? This is perhaps closer to the Kantian model of cosmopolitanism. That is, we who occupy the crust of the surface of the sphere, that this common condition and relationship bequeaths to cosmopolitanism. We could then make the argument that to the extent that the cities, global cities, after Sawson, Castells, whatever, constitute not just lots of little cities, but a common network city, one big city, a contiguous city, that this urban crust, that the common relationship to the infrastructures of the urban crust constitutes its own kind of cosmopolitanism, that this, going by the definitions of cosmopolitanism in the origins of the city, are brought back again in the globalization of the city and its spread across the surface of the earth in this way. The segmentations that we're looking at, the walled gardens, and I think it's clearly open to interpretation to the extent to which how it is the particular kind of cloud platforms in relationship to particular kinds of Westphalian states might be understood as being more open or closed models of citizenship, participation, jurisdiction, and so forth and so on within this as well. But but in one way or another, this is a different way of looking at this, of re-enclosing this now reopened space. So if the Westphalian territory, which was this loop system, held for a certain period of time, that the truly Copernican perspective that became available to us in the late 1960s and early 1970s required a different geometry of geography by which what Schmidt calls the nomos of the Earth, how it is that political systems, the logic of space by which they subdivide space. Right? For Westphalia was we're going to subdivide the land in two-dimensional plane. Seas weren't divided up, air wasn't divided up, land was divided up according to a two-dimensional projection. There becomes another geometry by which space can be subdivided and reorganized within this particular kind of way. And in this, these are, in certain ways, can be seen as a kind of primitive territorial capture, that this territory is opened up and it's going to be subdivided, it's going to be gathered into these structures as well. But I don't want to discount, and I hope I've made the connection really strongly, that what we may have seen as a utopian impulse in the 60s and 70s with the experimental architectural forms, and if we're talking about this sort of utopian logics of these sorts of, of open systems and breaking systems and these cosmopolitan gatherings, that it's intrinsic to a certain extent, if we follow Jameson's argument, that any of these utopias are islands, that they are closed systems, and in the condition of their islandness is a precondition for their status as a closed system. That's what makes them available to total design. And it's also what links then the utopian gestures of an Archigram or Superstudio or early OMA in the sense to what we may take to be the dystopian outcomes of similar paired doppelganger forms of megastructural utopias. But the fact remains that they were both responding to a similar kind of territorial opening provided by the Copernican perspective of a satellite view of Earth, with a similar kind of gesture, that is the gathering of larger amounts of space into a common envelope and the bequeathing of a specialized form of citizenship to those who live inside of that envelope. They're both doing this in a certain kind of way. Whether we want to take that as being a utopian or dystopian outcome, that's a different kind of question. And frankly, hopefully I made the case that I'm trying to stay ambivalent about that for as long as I can.